Our scripture reading this morning is from Acts chapter 9, verses 36 through 43. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics of other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. If you would please pray with me. Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you this day, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So I tried to think of the most unbelievable thing that I have ever done in my life, but unfortunately, nothing I could come up with even comes close to being raised from the dead. But it got me thinking about death and dying experiences. We hear about these, don't we, all the time, about people who have died and they've seen lights or they saw nothing and then they come back to life. And I always wanted to know, what people experience when they actually die. I mean, isn't that a big question that we all have? What happens on the other side? We want to know this. I never thought to question, though, whether folks had been raised from the dead, like that phrase. I always think of that as a Jesus thing, that Jesus was raised from the dead, or that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, or that Peter somehow raised Tabitha from the dead. But that's biblical stuff. That's not 21st century stuff. But I whipped out my computer, as I often do, and I Googled it. And you would be amazed at the number of stories that come up of folks that have actually been dead for more than 45 minutes, and then they have been brought back to new life. I was stunned. I had no idea. So these stories of raising individuals from the dead are stories that I would classify as modern miracles. There's no reason for folks to survive such an ordeal. One account I read said that the doctor worked on this guy for 45 minutes. He gave up. He finally pronounced the guy dead. He walks out of the room, and then he hears this voice, "Go shock him one more time." Now, I would have thought I was delirious if that had been me. You know, I've worked on this guy. I'm probably pouring sweat after doing heart compressions and or shocking some guy for 45 minutes. But this guy was a Christian, and he clearly understood that he was hearing the voice of God. And so after debating it for maybe 30 seconds, he turns right around and he goes back into the room. And all the staff is standing there, and they're like, "Why are you back? What's going on?" He said, "I want to shock him one more time." And they looked at him like he was crazy. But they trusted him because he was a well-known heart specialist. And so they fired up the machine. They shocked him one more time. His heart began to beat. And not just beat, but it was a regular heartbeat. And within moments, he opened his eyes and he was completely alert. And he wasn't brain dead. You know, after 10 minutes, they say that your brain is so starved of oxygen that you suffer brain damage. But there was nothing wrong with him. I find that to be a miracle, a modern day miracle. Reading these stories made me realize that there's so much about life that we just don't understand. Scientifically, we learn the mechanics of life, but it is hard to grasp the why. Why do we live? What is the purpose of life? We are raised to believe that our bodies exist in basically two states. We're either living or we are dead. And if you're not alive, you are dead. It's really simple. You're either alive or you're dead. I mean, is that what y'all were taught? That's what I was taught. There is no in between. But what if there is more to life and death than our vital signs? I'm reminded of the story of Jairus' daughter. Now, Jairus, he was one of the rulers of the synagogue, and he came up to Jesus because his daughter was sick, and he says, "Please help me, help me." So Jesus follows Jairus to his house, and he sees all these people out there wailing and crying and carrying on. He walks into the house, he kicks everybody out, and he says, "You know, why? Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Okay, now I'm confused. If she's only sleeping, then what is that in the dead or alive conversation? She looked dead. She wasn't breathing. She didn't have a heartbeat. But Jesus says she's only sleeping, and he reaches out and he touches her hand, and she sits right up. So I have these questions. Was she really sleeping in the sense that we go to sleep every night? Or was Jesus using the word sleeping instead of dead as a way to comfort the family and friends? Or was Jesus just out and out lying? Now, I don't believe the last one, but it does make me ask the question, and in the end, when he grabs her hand and simply tells her to get up, and she does, it really confuses me. Like, what is this thing about life and death? Well, this is what happens with Tabitha. She's dead. Everyone knows that she's dead. They bathe her. They place her in an upper room in preparation for the visitation, which will then be followed by the burial. But there are a few things that I find interesting about this passage. First of all, Tabitha is named as a disciple in the text. If she is in fact a disciple, she would be one of the only women in the Bible to be named such, which I think is pretty incredible. In her presence are other disciples. So when she dies, it is the other disciples who sent two men to Peter to the town called Lydda, which is near Joppa. And Peter, of course, he comes immediately, and they take him to the upper room. And just like Jesus with Jairus' daughter, Peter tells Tabitha to get up, and she does. It's a safe bet that Tabitha had been in this state for far longer than 45 minutes. I actually looked up how long it would take to walk from Lydda to Joppa. And according to Google Maps, it would have taken 4 hours and 9 minutes. Tabitha, therefore, would have been dead for over 8 hours by the time Peter arrived. I know, I find this humorous. This is really, I'm thinking about this going, wow. So she's been dead all day, basically, and he shows up and says, get up, and she does. Now, I have to say, I do believe in miracles. And I want to believe this one. I discovered in my life that there are miracles happening all the time, but I just kind of ignore them. Life gets in the way. We aren't as tuned in to miracles as the folks were during the days of Jesus. I mean, they saw a miracle happen. It's like, wow, how did that guy get up and walk after he'd been crippled all his life? Or how did that guy see after Jesus just touches his eyes? What is this about? And they saw miracles and it really transformed them. But we don't see those kinds of miracles, so we think. I think sometimes that our medical advancements keep us from seeing miracles in the same way. But I still believe. And at the same time, I still struggle with the why. Why Tabitha? What was it about Tabitha that was so special? And anytime I read a story like this, I'm curious as to why some are raised from the dead to new life, but not everybody. How did they choose? How did anyone ever decide who would come back to life and who wouldn't? And then I started thinking about the information that we're given in the text from a different angle. The text goes out of its way to tell us several important things. Mentioned that she was a disciple, but she lives in Joppa, and her name is Tabitha, which in the Greek means Dorcas, or is Dorcas, which actually means gazelle. And she was full of good works and acts of charity. That's all in like the very first little sentence there. It's a lot of information. So we've already touched on the fact that she was a disciple, which I think is cool enough, but it is important to note that she is from Joppa, which is modern-day Tel Aviv, or Jaffa, which is a port city on the fringes of Jewish society. Even in the first century, this was a happening place, one of the busiest ports in the region, but it was a mix of Greek and Jew. As such, we are given both her Greek and her Jewish name. And the image of being full of something means that she embodies these traits, that she lived them in her daily life. They weren't simply kind words that folks used to describe her. This was her life. She was love, which is what the word Dorcas and gazelle mean in the ancient text. There are many ways to read this passage, but one way of getting at the why Tabitha question might be to look at her as a bridge between these two societies. Peter was firmly planted in the Jewish world. And Paul, who hasn't quite shown up yet in Acts, was firmly planted in the Greek world. But Tabitha was situated in both. It's quite possible that the work she was doing in Joppa was so impactful that the lack of her presence would have meant the downfall of the spread of Christianity. There's an interesting thought that a woman in such a patriarchal society would be the game changer for this port city. What the text tells us is that because she was raised from the dead, this deed became known throughout Joppa, and that many believed in the Lord as a result of this act. And her testimony is her testimony, the end game. It seems so odd that this story is tucked in the pages of the book of Acts, and beyond these few verses, we have no more history of Tabitha. And yet I can imagine what she did with her experience. At Easter, we celebrated the resurrection of Jesus, who was raised to new life. And I talked about how we can be resurrected right now. One possible explanation for the resurrection of Tabitha is so that she could promote this earthly kind of resurrection. Think about the number of people as a seamstress she would have come in contact with, especially all of the poor that she sewed for. Imagine the number of individuals who might be given the opportunity to know the restoring love of Jesus because of Tabitha's experience. Being restored to life actually happens to us all the time. It just isn't nearly as dramatic. Every time we get an all clear from the doctor, we are restored to new life. Every time a child is born, we are restored to new life. Every time we give ourselves without thought of the cost, we are restored to new life. I was asked once in one of the many meetings I had to endure on my way toward ordination, what did Jesus believe in? At first, because of the person that asked that question, it was my history of Christianity professor, I thought it was a trick question. I could actually feel my stomach begin to lurch in fear that I might not know the correct answer, as if there was only one correct answer. And then I opened my mouth and even I was stunned at what came out. I said that Jesus believed in life. Life abundant. This is what Jesus came to bring the world. I came to bring you abundant life, new life. Jesus was always attempting to show us what new life meant, how to see the world differently, how to engage the world with all of our senses, how to help those we don't know, how to love those we'd rather hate. All of these things are about living a more whole and full life, a new life. His conversation with Nicodemus was about being born again, which literally means to live a new life, a restored life. In this context, there are many extraordinary things I could share with you about my life that you may or may not believe. All of them have to do with being raised to new life. And I have no doubt that we could all share those kinds of stories. We all have at least one moment in our lives where we know we have been raised to new life. The story of Tabitha is every bit our own story. We have the opportunity to affect the lives of those around us for the betterment of all of society. We have the opportunity to shake loose the old and be transformed into the new. We are all raised to new life. May it be so. Amen.